Hey, it's me, Dr. Newman, your professor in English 3 4-day survey of English Literature 1. As I said before, we're moving on to the late Middle Ages, and we're going to be studying Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. This video is intended as a kind of backgrounder to get you up to speed on some of the cultural contexts that inform a chivalric romance like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. So we're going to explain what that means, both romance and chivalric, and some of the associated values with it, and the historic circumstances in which that genre came to be enjoyed by the elites of medieval society. Let's begin. In a subsequent video, I'm going to talk more about Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and the circumstances of its composition itself. For now, it's suffice to say that it survives in one manuscript. Here's an illustration from that manuscript. You might recognize it as the beheading game in Fit 1. What did I just say? Fit 1? Okay, well, let's explain that just with some of the terms that we're going to use. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is usually described as a chivalric romance. We're going to talk about what that means. It is also an Arthurian tale, that is, it is set at the court of King Arthur. It is an alliterative poem. In the 14th century, there was a revival of the kind of alliterative poetry that had been practiced in Anglo-Saxon England, and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is one of the greatest instances of that kind of Middle English alliterative poetry. We don't call Beowulf or Sir Gawain and the Green Knight a novel. That is a bad move. We will call it a narrative poem. It is poetry. It is written in poetic lines and verse forms, but it's a narrative. It's not what we think. Typically, we think of poems now as being lyric poems, that is, short expressions of strong emotion or experience, but a narrative poem tells a story in poem form. Beowulf is actually divided into 3 fits, and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is divided into 4 fits. The fit is just a term that's used in Anglo-Saxon and Middle English poetry to describe the narrative sections, almost like chapters of an alliterative narrative poem. So, what is chivalric romance? Well, first of all, it's a romance, and while we use that word to describe a certain idea of love practices and a certain kind of novel that has its origins in the Middle Ages and in reimaginings of the Middle Ages in certain ways, but is not precisely the same. So I'd like you to sort of suspend your assumptions about what romance means. We're not necessarily talking about the novel that you buy on the rack at the CVS to relax with a scented candle in a bath. We're talking about a different kind of genre, although there are connections and there's a historical genealogy. But the word romance in the first instance comes from the fact that the word romance was written in the vernacular. That is to say, not Latin. The vernacular comes from a Latin word meaning the marketplace, a place where you buy and sell things. So everyday language. Latin was used for scholarship and for worship, and English and French and Italian, these were not considered sacred or prestigious languages in the earlier part of the Middle Ages, and so they were. We call them the vernaculars. But as the aristocracy of medieval Europe got richer and more literate, they became more interested in stories and books themselves, but they didn't necessarily have, if they were laity, even if they were aristocracy, they didn't have the kind of education where they could appreciate the Latin literature still being read by priests and monks who were very learned, by ancient Roman authors like by Virgil and Ovid. So works were written often by clerics who knew Latin in Romance languages. Sometimes they were even translations of Latin works into the vernacular, and so these were called romances because they were written originally in the Romance tongues, that is, the Roman tongues, French, Italian, Spanish, that had descended from Latin. This here is a manuscript detail from a very famous, one of the earliest romances that survive. It's a text called The Knight of the Cart by the 12th century French poet Chrétien de Troyes. This is the poem that is one of the earliest stories about King Arthur's court. It is the first poem in which Lancelot appears. And it is a very important poem in the history of the origin of chivalric romance as a genre. Romance, generally, beyond just chivalric romances, but generally romances feature virtuous heroes and heroines and adventure. In its most basic form, there's one central character in one adventure after another. And this is something where the modern romance novel has in common with the ancient and medieval romances. They're often episodic in nature, where a virtuous or a character who's in some way admirable will deal with one struggle or one episode or one issue after another until finally there's a resolution. It's said that heroes and heroines express in some way or encapsulate the values of their society. So, for example, the heroine of your Hallmark Christmas movie, she is going to be a character who's in some way, and she's industrious, she works hard, but she's also, a tender-hearted, soft person who will give up her big city job for the, to bake cookies in Christmas Town or whatever. So, in some way, that heroes and heroines always reflect the values of our society, and sometimes, I think, as we've seen in Beowulf already, can reflect the contradictions or conflicts in those values or ideals. Modern romances also include a lot of genre fictions. Flash Gordon was a serial movie in the 1930s, remade hilariously in 1979 or 1980, in which Flash was this high school quarterback or college quarterback or pro football player, something like that, who goes into space and rescues space princesses and fights space monsters. It was this sort of matinee that Star Wars was actually based on. Star Wars was a sort of revival of these old school 1930s space adventures and other kinds of adventures. Cowboy movies, superhero comics are another example. In its most basic form, one central character in one adventure after another. Doesn't this describe most comic book heroes? And specifically, there's a way in which in its most basic form, the heroes of romance don't change. Everything sort of gets reset after each adventure. So, the essential element of plot in romance is adventure, which means that romance is basically a sequential form. But books have beginnings and endings. Specific stories have beginnings and endings, particular tales, unlike, serial movies or comic books or TV shows. Each adventure, each sequence has its own structure. There'll be a series of minor adventures, usually leading to a major or climactic adventure. That major adventure is usually announced from the beginning. We might call it the quest, right? What is more basic to romance and to adventure than the idea of the quest? The questing knight is still burned into sort of our collective culture, our collective memory as this archetypal story. And that story will usually feature a journey. Some of you may have taken isn't there a course here on the Hero's Quest or something like that, or Heroes or something? Anyway, there's the journey, and then in the course of the journey, there is one or more struggles leading up to a crucial struggle, sometimes called the pathos, a battle in which hero or foe or both must die. And then finally, there is the recognition, the exaltation of the hero. The hero is given due credit for their accomplishment, their achievement, their reward. Hello, here we are, you're getting a medal. Good job, hero. I guess your work here is done, or not. Usually there is a hero protagonist and a villain or antagonist. And this is one of the structures of romance as well. And I'm talking about romance in its broadest sense that isn't just tied to one historical period or time. I already mentioned Star Wars and Flash Gordon as examples of romance. We have other examples of romance as well that feature a hero against villain, and here in both cases we have examples of a character in one adventure after another, representing certain virtues or ideals of the society that produces that in going on journeys, having struggles, and sometimes having climactic battles with the main bad guy, and then being in some way recognized for it sometimes, but then sometimes you just hit the reset button, don't you? Okay, Chivalric Romance. What else is there to say about it? Northrop Frye, famous Canadian literary critic, talks about romance as being on a continuum, and that some romance is more naturalistic, it's more down to earth, it's more realistic, but that there's a continuum between romance and myth, and that the more close the romance is to myth, the more the hero will have divine attributes and the enemy demonic mythical qualities. So even within, for example, the superhero genre, you can get a character like Spider-Man who, goes to high school or whatever and has sort of everyday problems, and he's got to help his aunt make the rent or whatever, versus Superman who can fly around the sun so fast that time goes backward and fights like enormous sort of brain creatures from outer space or whatever. There's a continuum. Romance is ahistorical, unlike epic. Now, you might say, but wait a second. Hold on, Dr. Newman. King Arthur takes place in history, and other, Batman may be, not real, but it takes place in modern America or Gotham City or whatever. In fact, the stories that romance tells may be set in particular historical periods. They may be set in ancient Greece or Rome or medieval Europe, or the court of King Arthur, or the American West between the years of the Civil War and the turn of the 20th century. It doesn't matter, because they aren't about history, even when historical places or people appear. They're about the individuals, and they're about the individual adventures. And they usually don't have to do with the foundation of nations or states, or the origins of peoples or laws. Those are all qualities that belong to epic. Virgil's famous Aeneid is about the founding of Rome. Some scholars view Homer's Iliad as the genesis of a sort of collective concept of Greekness. But romance is not about the national characteristics or historical events. It is at the same time more individual, focusing on specific characters, and more universal, focusing on ahistorical events. We all have fear. We all seek to overcome our enemies or our difficulties or our struggles. We all seek to better I hope we all seek to sort of better ourselves or overcome our personal demons in some way. This is the realm, both psychological, universal, and archetypal, that romance works on. This has been part 1 of a 3-part series on chivalric romance and courtly love. In the next video, I will turn from what makes romance romance, more specifically to what makes romance chivalric romance. What do knights have to do with romance? That is, the kind of knights that ride horses. Tune in.